So you finally get some drawing pencils, and now you're left wondering, well, what do these numbers mean and why is there no eraser? So the numbers and letters actually correspond to the level of hardness or softness of the graphite found within the pencil. And to show you what that means, let's go over to camera 2. Camera 2. Okay, so let's take a look at what we're talking about here when we're talking about these drawing pencils. These are 3 drawing pencils, each from a different brand, and you can see that along the body of it, near the rounded end, you'll see these numbers and letters on each of them. Now, you'll notice that each of these is always located on the end of the pencil. It will always have a letter, it'll sometimes have a number, and independent of what brand, it'll always be on this side. But to make it a little bit easier on self, instead of looking at ones by a bunch of different brands, we're gonna look at one set. So pencils come as an individual, like we just saw right here, but they also come in whole sets, usually in these tin guys. So when we're looking at pencil sets, how we'll know which ones are included, if we look down here in the bottom left, usually somewhere on the face of it, it'll name which items there are. And you'll see this has a 6B all the way to a 4H. Okay, so let's get this open to where we can actually see what's happening. Let's get this spun around. Okay, you can clearly tell which one of these is used the most, but let's get this up to where we can actually see what's happening. So if we look here, we can see that this set goes from 6B all the way to 4H, and right about here in the middle, we have something marked as just a B, we have an HB, and then we have an F. Okay, so let's get this zoomed in a little bit more, that way we can see what's happening. Okay, so now that we've got this framed up a little bit better so we can see what's going on, first thing we need to talk about is what does the B, what do the H, and what does the F stand for? So basically, the way that we need to understand it is B stands for soft, H stands for hard, and F stands for landing somewhere in the middle. Now technically, these stand for something else, but in the case for us understanding how to use them as pencils, what we need to understand is just B is soft, H is hard, F, HB, landing somewhere in the middle. They're halfway between the softness and hardness that you would find in the B's and H's. So thanks to the magic of editing, let me get that written up there so that we can remember that. Okay, perfect. So we got our little key up here. B is soft, H is hard, and F is in between. Now, when it comes to what these do in a practical sense, how they are different and why it helps to have a variety of them is in how they respond to pressure. Basically what that means is when we apply the pencil to the surface, we drag it across, how hard we press the pencil it'll react differently given whether it's a B or an H or how that number exists. Now, in addition to understanding the hard, soft, and in between, what we also need to keep in mind is what these numbers do. So the way the numbers work, the higher the number, the more it is. So if we look at a 2B and a 6B, the 6 higher than the number 2 means that the 6B is softer. So an easy way to think about it is the higher the number, the more soft or hard it is. There will never be like a 2F or anything. It's always just sort of an in-between guy. HBs will also never have a number. That's just literally landing right in between the softness of the B's and the hardness of the H's. Let's get that added to our key real quick. Okay, so we've got our key for hardness, softness, in between, and we've also got it down that the higher the number, the more hard or soft it is, it obviously being the pencil. Let's get a look at what that actually means. Okay, so what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna get each one of these pencils, and as I go from the left side to the right side, I'm gonna start off on the left, pressing it as hard as I can on the page, and as I drag it right to the end of this R, I'm gonna start to let up on the pressure. So we're gonna start here on the very far left side, and I'm gonna press it as hard as I can, and I'm gonna gradually make it lighter in a continuous value band. That way you all can see how these respond differently to pressure and why the difference is important. Okay, let's get 6B written on there. And I'm gonna start off pressing it as hard as I can, and I'm trying to keep the pressure slowly getting even, and until I get to the end and it's just barely being pressed to the page. So what we see On the left side, it can get very dark, and as it goes to right, it gets a lot lighter. Now, what we also notice with the Bs is we'll start to see more of this paper texture, this kind of sketchy, almost static look we have going on in the Bs. We're going to see a lot more in the Bs and less so in the H's, because the softer the pencil, the more it picks up on the texture of the page. So I actually realized as I was editing this that I asked why there are no erasers in the beginning. I didn't actually talk about that. Basically, there are a bunch of different type of erasers. There's a kneaded, there's a plastic, there are a bunch of them. But basically, instead of there being this sort of weird pink thing on the end of your pencil that just makes everything turn pink and erase terribly, they're a separate thing, but there'll be a different video on that. So now that we've got all of these drawn out from 6B to 4H, we can start to really notice the difference. Now that we get that difference because in the Bs, again, the higher the number, the softer it is. The softer this graphite becomes, the wider the mark it tends to make. Like if I were to get another 6B out here, we can see that when we press it really hard, it can get an extremely thick line. When we press it soft, it's not as dark, but the thickness of that line stays more or less the same. Now, obviously, part of that has to do with how sharp or not sharp our tip is, but the softer the graphite, the more quickly it will round to become a thick line. For comparison, let's grab a 4H and let's put those lines side by side. So this was our 6B pressed hard, this was our 6B pressed soft, and now let's get a 4H pressed hard and a 4H pressed soft. Let's actually give some 4H hard and 4H soft. And let's get, oh, this is gonna be hard to write. Even when you're trying to write with tiny letters, because of the soft, 6B hard. Because of the softness of these soft pencils, it makes it kind of hard to write small HB soft. So even when we just draw little lines, we can see the difference right away. The Bs get much wider because they're softer much more quickly, and even when you press them softly, they'll still have that line weight thickness. Line weight is a fancy way of saying how thick or thin the line is. Obviously, in comparison, the hardness, it stays a thinner line, even when you press it really hard. Like, let me try to really ham that in there. Yeah, it still doesn't quite get anywhere near as thick. So even when you really go ham on it, it doesn't get thick, but it can still get very light. Now, why does this difference even matter in the first place? So part of what makes it nice to have a variety of these, obviously we don't need to use every single one of these every time, but what helps is when we're starting to draw something, like let's say that we're going to draw one of those kind of, generic circles that we're going to give a shadow about. When we want to draw something, we can draw that circle, 3, 4, 5 times, and if we use something like a 4H, we won't see it as much. Let me get a 6B, for example, and let me just give a 6B a couple of times over here. This thing is going to be horrendously dark. Let me press this as light as I can. Even when I press it as light as I can with the 6B, that circle is still darker. Obviously, when we're starting a drawing, we want to start with the harder pencils. That way we can put down a lot of drawing quickly, and if it doesn't work out perfectly and we're trying to figure it out, it won't be that dark straight away. So let's try to draw this orb as if it exists underneath the light that's right around here. I have a light source coming from over here, so let's go ahead and put an L for the light source. Let's put that in a circle. Let's give it some sunshiny lines. So the light coming from the top left, if it were to hit this orb, just as a quick demo in how to use these different pencils, let's give this a thing. I can kind of like, ooh, let's make that round. Let's figure out the shadow comes around here. You can use a 4H and you can draw into this a whole lot, almost like not an infinite amount of times, but a whole lot more. Once you get the kind of vague shape of what's going on with a 4H or one of these other kinds of H's, then once we have those correct lines, or those lines that are more accurate, then we can come in here with something like a 6B and punch those up to make them more apparent. Now, obviously, when we're using a 6B, we want to kind of give it the careful juice, but let me just kind of give it a maximum beans Boom, one straight line, giving it the gusto. You can see that hard contour very quickly, and we can give it this sort of shadow right here. So in 2 lines with the 6B, we can clarify all of those little lines that were happening with the 4H. Now, obviously, if we were to come in here and give this a kind of surface value that would be similar to this, we could use something like, let's not use something as powerful as a 6B. Let's try and grab a 4B. I tend to use things more like 4 or 2Bs. You can obviously tell how much this 2B gets used. When I go H's, I usually only go up between 2 and 4. 2s and 4s are usually harder or dark enough to work almost every time. One thing that's important to remember is everyone tends to draw a little bit different. Some of you will draw with a lot of pressure on the page. Some of you will draw like you're tickling the paper. So part of which pencils work best for you involve playing around with them a little bit. But let's go ahead and let's grab this 4B. Let's try to just use only a kind of 4B and give this a kind of attribution of value. So I'm barely pressing it on here, and I'm kind of alternating our lines in different directions. When we alternate our lines, what we're getting is an accumulated value, and this is an example of cross contour. There'll be a different thing on that. But I can give something like a 4B a lot of small passes, and every single pass I do it gets gradually darker. If I wanted to go sort of like ham fist with it, I can just come in here, press it a little bit harder, and get that entire shadow filled out real quick. I can press it a little bit harder around the edge and get kind of that like darker shadow here on the end. Now, obviously, that's not the most handsome orb on the planet. I'll make a separate thing going over value, but this is a pretty good example of the differences between the B's and the H's. F's kind of land in the middle. Again, F's don't really, I'll be honest, F's are kind of the weirdos of the bunch. They aren't totally necessary if you have an H or a B, to be perfectly honest. Also, we've probably all seen things that look like this. This is sort of our regular number 2 pencil. Fun fact, if you guys are a little bit confused by this, you've actually been using an HB every time you've used a number 2. This just happens to be a regular school pencil that lists it as both a number 2 and an HB. Actually right there on the spectrum. Okay, so now that we've got our little orb guy drawn, and now that we've got our chart here showing the differences, one thing I want to mention is we can kind of see it happening in here with the orb, but it's a little bit easier if we just put them side by side. When we look at the H's, because it's a harder pencil, like we can kind of see up here, every time we draw a line, that line maintains its thickness, and it makes it much harder to kind of camouflage the direction of them. If we were to come in here to this sort of sad egg shape, if we wanted to give it a real subtle gradation, we can't hide those lines as much. We sort of see each one individually. If we sort of try to give a gradient, we'll see all the lines. Whereas instead of this 4H, we use something like a 4B, what we'll notice is that every time we draw a line, if we press it really soft, it's much easier to kind of camouflage that line. Obviously, this comes down to also how much control you exercise in making the length and pressure of the line uniform. But you can get a bunch of these lined up side by side, and if you keep it more or less even, you can make a kind of value area rather than a series of scratchy lines. Now again, obviously that's because these lines are harder, and it's much more difficult for us to kind of blend them together. What we see are just individual marks. If we were to run these back and forth, we could emulate something kind of like this. If we maintain pressure, but even when we sort of look at these edges, we can see the individual marks being made as a line. Now, like I said, each of you will draw with a different kind of pressure naturally. Some of you will press real hard, some of you will press real soft. If you've got kind of a heavy hand, if you tend to draw real dark, maybe don't use a high B. Maybe use something like a 2B. If you tend to draw really soft, try to go for something like a 6B like we've got. You can get a 6B nightmarishly dark, or you can come in here and you can press it really light and get these really sort of delicate candy floss lines. Okay, so that's pretty straightforward. video showing you the differences between pencil hardness and softness. Remember that, you know, a big part of kind of all things creative, but especially drawing, is just messing around with it. Whatever pencils you have on hand, whether they're 4Bs or 6Bs or 2Hs or whatever, just try and take a section of paper and just sort of mess around with them. You'll start to find out what kind of feels more natural for you, and you'll figure out which ones work best for what you're wanting to do. Remember, if you tend to draw hard, go with the lower numbers in the Bs. If you tend to draw soft, go with the high numbers for the Bs. Or if you just have a few pencils, you don't know what they kind of do, just draw around with them, trying to get a gradient, and then compare them to what we looked at earlier. That way you can get a kind of ballpark of how they operate. If there's more that you guys want to know about pencils or anything else, I'm gonna keep making these. But if there's something that you're interested in knowing about that I haven't done a topic on yet, let me know and I'll make a video on that. But that's pretty much it. Thanks for watching. I guess if you have any questions and you're one of my students, send me an email. If not, you know how to get a hold of me on YouTube. Everyone knows how YouTube works. Go team!